Hebrews 11. I'll probably say it again, but as you're turning there, if you ever find yourself reading through Hebrews and then reading through the corresponding places in Genesis and other places that we're going to go to, and you find yourself scratching your head going, really, is this the best that God could find? The answer is yes, which is encouraging for two reasons. One, if we were writing the Bible, we would not have written it this way. I guarantee you, all of the characters would have had better backstories, right? If I were writing a story that exalted God and pointed people to God, I wouldn't find like people who were on the Jerry Springer show and roll them out. Right? Isn't that where you are? You find yourself there occasionally, so it's cool. So it just reinforces the fact that God did, in fact, write the Bible because we would not have done it that way. The other thing it encourages us is when you look at your own life and you look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, you're a screw-up. You look at the Bible and go, I guess God can use that. And so it's encouraging. The people in the Bible, we find in the New Testament, they were people of like passions like we are, people just like us. In some cases, they were people who were worse than us, and God accomplished quite a bit through them. So never doubt what God can accomplish through us as a result. Hebrews chapter 11. Before we begin this morning, I want to go over our memory verse. How many of you, without looking at your program, at least know the number? Romans, wrong book. Hebrews 11, verse 6. There we go. We'll get there. Hebrews 11, verse 6. Would you read this aloud with me? But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. I believe that you can learn that. Some of you are shaking your head. You're like, I like it in my Bible better. Fine, memorize that one. I actually don't care. Memorize it somewhere, because it's an important truth. We need to understand that God is pleased when we believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Well, we did take one thing off of our calendar as we rolled from Friday to Saturday to Sunday. We didn't get it off of our sign yet. That's coming. But we had the Keffers were here on Friday night in concert. I think many of you are here for that. I hope that you enjoyed it and were blessed by them. I know talking to them, it really was an effort. I mean, Brother Gary talked about driving from Ohio to here to be here. He literally did that to be here. I said, you could have, death in the family is one of those providential hindrances. You could have just, sent the kids, and we'd have been happy with Paul and the kids and everybody. And he's like, no, when I make a commitment, he said, if there's any human way to get there, I get there. And so I have a lot of respect for that. But at one point during the concert Friday night, as the kids were up here singing, I leaned up to Gary and I said, hey, did you ever think that you would see this go into the third generation? And without blinking, without flinching, and without missing a beat, he said, yeah, that was the plan. That was always the plan. I thought, well, that's a lot of audacity. You can imagine any of us at a younger age going, yeah, I'm gonna go on the road for Jesus. I'm gonna go out and just live full-time singing in any church that'll have me. You figure, we had 48 last Friday night. We had 48 people here. For us, that's awesome. For them, that's a small crowd, right? And so you can imagine going out on the road singing to small churches all over New England. Most of the churches I've ever seen them in were relatively small churches. And then to have the audacity for it to be part of your long-term plan that not only am I going to drag my kids on the road with me, Paul has done this his entire life. He grew up on the road just like his kids are growing up on the road. But the audacity to say, I'm going to see this go into not just the second generation, but the third generation. Gary's going to retire here in the next couple years. He didn't say when, and I don't think he knows when, but you can only do so many miles, and he's 70 this year. So at some point, he's going to retire, and Paul is going to take it over and just run with it. And I think, and the kids are going to come in, and that vision is just going to extend. I thought, wow, that's a lot of audacity to think, wow, you're going to go into the second generation, you're going to go into the third generation, that it's going to be passed down to your children. But it wasn't just a hope so for him, it was a plan so. He didn't just hope it would happen, plan for it to happen. He kind of took steps to make sure it would happen. I remember the first couple times that I saw Paul. Kepler's been coming up to New England since the mid-'90s, and I saw them very early on in that process. And it's hard to believe that that's been as many years as it has been, but you're talking a quarter of a century almost. And I remember Paul, he was just this geeky kid with, back in the 90s, we're not a favorite to anybody, right? With the suit that was a little too big and his dad's tie and the big glasses. And he actually plays the bass guitar. His sister Amy plays the keyboard. And so their music was primarily Amy on keys and Paul on bass. And that was it. And he's now, of course, now he's kind of rocking the beard. It's a little graying. And he's got his own kids up here. Making sure that continues on into the next generation. It's the plan. Didn't just assume it. Made sure it happened. And I got thinking about it, though. We should all really have that same kind of audacity that our faith and our life would be handed down to our children. I can't tell you how many times over the last many years that I have been in the ministry that I have talked to somebody who is older, who has looked at their children who are out of church with a bit of a broken heart and said, Pastor, would you pray for me? Would you pray for my children? My children aren't walking with God. My children have adopted another faith. My children have adopted another lifestyle that is ungodly. And it breaks parents' heart. And it breaks my heart as a pastor. But I look at it, and there's part of me that kind of a little more calculating professional side, if you will. It does exist. And I think, you might actually be the cause of the problem. Parents who didn't take sufficient measures to hand their faith to their children, who didn't take the steps, didn't live it at home. I mean, if you only live this on Sundays, you can pretty much count your kids are out. You have to live it at home as well. And that doesn't mean fake at home. They know fake, right, kids? You know fake when you see it? Yeah. You be genuine. Don't pretend you're perfect. But have that faith. Make sure you hand it off to our children. Because the alternative is they do walk away from the faith. The alternative is they do walk away from the life that we have, that we enjoy, that we want to hand down to them. Our tour through the Faith Hall of Fame, Hebrews 11, really is kind of this Faith Hall of Fame, takes us to a guy named Isaac. Now, Isaac is an interesting character in your Old Testament. We're going to read part of his story in the book of Genesis. Isaac has about one chapter that's his in the Bible. Most of the time, Isaac was Abraham's son or Jacob's father. But he has like one chapter that's his. The spotlight kind of graced him. He didn't necessarily do fantastic things with it. He dug a bunch of wells, made a deal with Abimelech, and moved on to being Jacob's dad. So it's kind of an interesting, almost a transitional life, though in many respects, Isaac is a type of Jesus. There's a lot of parallels that we see between Isaac and Jesus. The idea we saw last week with him being sacrificed and willingly. Even one of the things in here today, which we're not going to hit on, I'll just kind of tease it out there for you, where he became the substitute of the older brother, voluntarily substituting himself there. But as we look at Isaac's entry, it's actually a very short entry. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 20. I'm not even putting my glasses on to read this. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. That's it. That's the whole entry. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Now, how many of you are willing to bet there's a lot more to the story than that? Oh, definitely. I mean, when you think about dysfunctional families, and some of us have dysfunctional families, actually, truth be told, all of us have dysfunctional families. There is no such thing as an ideal family that functions normally or, perfectly. Because they're all filled with imperfect people that are all dysfunctional people, so how can our families be really anything else? But when you think of like really dysfunctional families, and then you multiply that, add in some steroids, you're going to get Isaac and his family. They took dysfunction to whole new heights, or whole new depths, really, as the case may be. So we go back to the book of Genesis for his story. Genesis chapter 25, and we're going to run into here in Genesis 25 the sons of Isaac. And this is kind of the backstory to this entry, but it's the kind of backstory that the story doesn't make sense without. You ever have those kind of stories? Like, it just doesn't make sense without the backstory, and that's kind of where we are this morning. Genesis chapter 25, we're introduced to Isaac and his starter family, right? In verse 1, it would help if I'm in the right place. Verse 21, rather. Excuse me, goodness. Verse 21. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Isaac at this point is 40 years old. He has gotten married. His wife is not able to have children. There is a real trial in that, especially if you're really desiring to have children. And so he got married at 40 years old, tried and prayed for 2 decades, 20 years of trying and praying before God finally answered that request, and Rebekah was able to conceive. She conceived twins. Which just shows no matter how you do the whole fertility thing, you end up with more than you asked for. But that's what they ended up with, was twins. And if we drop all the way down to verse 22, which is, I guess, not that far considering we started in verse 21. But, I keep thinking we're in 1. Don't mind me. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife. Verse 22, but the children struggled together within her, and she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so there were sons not just of a father's prayer, but they were sons of a divine prophecy. That these 2 boys, who you could imagine, moms, ladies, and let's don't go into details for us men because we really can't handle it. But you can imagine your kids fighting before they were born. That's what's going on. I have a hard enough time with my kids fighting after they're born. I'm like, there's 6 of you. I can replace you. Stop. Actually, that doesn't work so well. I understand that. But you can imagine them fighting before they were born, and that's what's going on. So she goes to God, and she starts praying, God, what in the world is going on here? If I'm going to have children, what in the world is going on? And God said, there are 2 very different people that are in there, and they are going to be born, and they are going to be 2 very different people once they get out. And so there is this prophecy, and it's very noteworthy, the tail end of that, the older shall serve the younger. In most of the Middle Eastern cultures, most cultures around the world, the oldest was the one who received the inheritance, received the birthright, received the blessing, received all that there was to be received, sometimes to the absolute exclusion of his other siblings, and sometimes just a bigger portion than the rest of his siblings. And so it's unusual in this prophecy that the older would serve the younger, that the younger sibling would be the one who carried on the family name. The younger sibling would become the patriarch, if you will, of the family. And yet that was the prophecy that Rebekah received. So we continue down into verse 27. So the boys grew after they were born, obviously. We skipped that part. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. 2 different kinds of people. Notice this, it gets worse. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. How many of you sense trouble brewing already? In that verse alone is just mountains of trouble. But 2 very different kinds of people. Esau was a manly man. He was the one who had the beard out to here, who wore plaid and denim exclusively all the time, except for when he went to leather. But just, soft fur is just not his thing. And he was out in the field, and as we get going a little bit into this, you'll see that, he was manly man, and he smelled like a manly man, and I don't mean a cologned manly man, I just mean like a musky manly man. And then you have Jacob, who hung out in the tents, who was a good cook, hung out with mom, did girly things. Not that girly things are bad. How many of you guys like to cook? How many of you guys are good at cooking? How many of you know how to sew? Anyone? Yeah, see, these are all good skills. So very different people, though. And as a result, there was a bit of favoritism in the home. And this is just always bad. God bless you. This is always bad in your house. If your kids say, hey, which of you is my favorite? My response is this. And I get it from Luke. You're my favorite Luke. You're my favorite Gideon. You're my favorite daughter. Yeah, whatever it may be. My nephews and niece even tried this. Oh, well, you're my favorite Daniel. You're my favorite Mackenzie. You're my, you can't play favorites because favorites have a way of really warping kids. And that's exactly what happened here. Isaac loved Esau. Why? Because being a typical man, he liked to eat. And Esau was a good hunter, and Dad was a good eater. And Mama loved Jacob because Jacob hung out in the tent with her. This is a problem. It's a problem. But that's the backstory. That's the sons of Jacob. Now we're going to skip over to Genesis chapter 27 because we want to look at, and this is where the author of Hebrews has us, at the blessing of Jacob. And this is where we want to get to this morning. What in the world was going on with Jacob blessing his children? But you need to know a little bit about his children before we get to the blessing. Look with me, Genesis chapter 27. We'll start in verse 1 there. Now it came to pass, when Isaac was old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. Then he said, behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now, therefore, please take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and make me savory food such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. I find it interesting that he specified, I do not know the day of my death. Most of us don't. Anybody have that on your calendar, in your planner already? Most of us don't. Here's the funny thing, right? We have now moved. Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. He was 60 years old when his sons were born. We have actually just skipped in this chapter, in floating through from 25 to 27. We have skipped 100 years, give or take. Isaac is about 160 years old. You say, well, it's about time that he's, getting ready to die. Except that, if we were to continue reading, we have another time marker that takes us at least 20 more years into the future, and Isaac's still there. So here he is at 160-ish years old, and he says, I'm going to die. I need to bless you. You need to go get me some food, and I'll bless you. But he wasn't anywhere near dying. He still had 20 years to go. But this is the setting. Now, he wanted one last big meal. I think in my mind as I read this, and this is just me, I think in my mind as I read this, that he's like, I'm going to eat one more big meal, I'm going to bless my son, I'm going to curl up in my bed, and I'm going to die. You ever had days that just felt like that? The body starts to ache, your attitude is, and you're like, yeah, I'm just going to die today. Just get it over with. I think that's where Isaac was. It had to be frustrating to not be able to see. And as we read along, I think maybe the rest of his senses were starting to go downhill too. So it was like, I'm just going to get it over with. I think this is what he's thinking. Now, you remember Sarah listening in the tent? Yeah, apparently that was not exclusive to Sarah, because here's Rebecca listening outside the tent, hears the instruction. She hears the instruction to Esau. Esau, go get your bow and arrow, go out into the field, go get some venison, cook it up, bring it to me. You know how I love good barbecue. That's basically what we're dealing with, right? Meat cooked over an open fire, we call that grilling or barbecuing. Take your pick, I don't care, but you know how it works, right? And so Rebecca gets it in her mind that she doesn't want Esau to get the blessing. Can you imagine this, moms? You decide, I don't want my oldest son to receive the blessing of his father. I'm going to manipulate the situation so that my younger son gets it. That's what happens. So she sets out a plan. She calls Jacob to her, and she says, Jacob, this is what your dad has told your brother. We're going to take care of business here. I want you to go out. I want you to kill a couple goats from the herd. Bring them in. We'll get them cooked up. I know how your dad likes his meat grilled. We'll get it grilled just perfectly. Now, I have no idea if goat and deer taste the same way. I've only had deer a couple times, and I've never had goat. But I'm thinking they must be similar, which is why I don't eat goat. I didn't like deer. And so they get it together. There's the plan. Now, Jacob looks at his mom, and he's like, are you crazy? I don't know if you've met my brother Esau or not, but he's like a WWE wrestler. And I'm like, not. Right? He's big. He's burly. He's tough. He's got hair everywhere. I don't even have everywhere to have hair. Like, Mom, he stinks. If I go in there and try to pass myself off, I don't care how blind Dad is, he's going to know something's up. And she's like, trust me, don't worry about it. We'll make it work. So, against his better judgment, actually Jacob didn't have any better judgment at this point in his life. He just went ahead and did it. He went out and he killed some goats. Mom started grilling it. Mom found some of Esau's clothes and said, here, try these on. You can imagine that suit. You know, it would be like Luke trying on my jacket. He's like, this thing is just, oh, really? Mom, we have a problem. He has a big bushy beard. And I didn't shave this morning, but I didn't get to the big bushy stage yet. And his arms are hairy, and my arms are smooth. My skincare regimen is just different than his. And so his mom, as the meat's grilling, as she's trying to air out this clothes a little bit and get them on to Jacob, they actually take the skins of the goat and they wrap it around his neck and under his beard and on his arms and on his hands. This gives you an idea how hairy Esau is. At the point where you need goat skin to compensate, that's a hairy dude. And Jacob, not so much. But here's the plan. Now, you remember that prophecy I told you about that Rebekah had received? Who was going to serve whom? The younger brother, or the older brother, was going to serve the younger. So as I look at this scenario, best case scenario, I'm thinking she's trying to help God out. Like somehow God is incapable of making this prophecy happen unless I help him. And in that true human, the ends justify the means, I'm just going to go ahead and just violate every kind of moral principle I hold and make it happen. Because that's what God would do, right? No. The ends never justify the means. The means are always really the point. So that's the best case scenario. She's trying to help God out. The worst case scenario is she's trying to help herself out, making sure that her favorite son is the one who gets to manage the family, and not that barbarian that is her other son. Either way, bad business. But what could possibly go wrong? Right? And so here's Jacob. He's wearing these clothes that are dragging behind him. They're just too big. He's trying to hold his nose because they stink. He's got this huge platter of goat looking like deer. And he's got goat skin wrapped around his neck and his arms and his hands. It's a good thing Isaac was blind because he'd have doubled over in laughter and died right there. And so he walks in the room making this presentation. So we skip down to verse 18. He went to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am." "Who are you, my son?" He's like, wait a minute. I wasn't expecting Esau or Jacob today. And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn." That's a pretty bold-faced lie. I have done just as you told me. I haven't done anything you told me. Please arise and sit and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. How many of you think Isaac was a tad confused? If you read through this passage, and I'd encourage you to do it on your own, but read through this passage, and several times Isaac's like, who are you again? Wait, who are you? Are you sure? Because Isaac may not have been able to see, but apparently his ears still worked. And apparently, though he hadn't had a lot of conversations with Jacob, it was not the big, burly, deep, baritone, manly man voice of Esau that was hitting him. It was the tenor of Jacob. You see, did they really have those parts? I have no idea. I just made that up. But that's the way I envision it in my mind. Verse 21, Isaac said to Jacob, please come near me, that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. And so Jacob, with Esau's clothes and the skin wrapped around his arms and his hands and his neck, comes up to give his dad a hug, and he's like, well, that feels about right. Tells you how rough of a texture that Esau had going. And so he's confused, but the lie and the food and the smell and, I don't know, coupled with maybe some infirm thinking, carried the day. He ate the food and he bestowed the blessing. And so we get Isaac's blessing, part 1. Look at in verse 27 of chapter 27 here. And he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing and blessed him and said, and I love this, ready? Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. What kind of fields has God blessed? What kind of fields produce wonderful crops? Those that are thoroughly fertilized. And so he smells Jacob and says, well, you smell like a ripely fertilized field. God bless you, my son. I'm not kidding when I say that Esau stunk. Anyway, verse 28, therefore, may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let the peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. Rebekah's plan worked. In a word, he got it all. He got it all. So Isaac is blessed. Verse 30. Now it happened, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from hunting. And oh my goodness, how many of you think this is about to go south in a hurry? You knew it couldn't end well, right? We knew that. We see Jacob walking around in Esau's clothes, holding his nose, carrying a tray of things with goat skins wrapped all over, and you're like, this is not going to end well. And it didn't. Esau comes in, he gets to Dad's tent, and he says, Dad, I got your food. Why don't you rise up, eat, and bless me? And Isaac says, who are you? I just gave the blessing to somebody else. And this manly man, this burly man, this tough man was instantly reduced to tears. And I think that Esau did nothing small. And I think when Esau cried, it went something like this. Now, I don't know that it did. But that's just what I hear in my voice, in my head. Maybe the voices in my head talk too much. I don't know. But I think he cries out in this big, burly, manly, no! And the tears begin to flow because all of the emotions of Esau are big, and they're bad, and they're raw. And he wears them on his muscle arm and his sleeve. And he begins to cry out because he knows what has happened. Nobody has to tell him anything. He knows who's been here. He knows. He may not know the particulars, but he knows who's walking around with a target on their back. Because Esau knows a thing or two about how to use martial weapons. And Isaac says, your brother came in by trickery, but I blessed him, and he is blessed. And Esau cries out, is there nothing left for me? And so Isaac finds a blessing. And so it's a second blessing here in verse 39. Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. Here's what that blessing boils down to. You will make your own way in this world, serving your brother, and eventually you'll get over the fact that he got it all. You're going to have to make your own way, and eventually you'll get over that. That's quite a blessing. But he had already given everything to Jacob. That's all that was left. Now that's pretty much where the narrative ends. You can imagine that there's going to be an oath of vengeance uttered at some point, and Esau is going to say, I'm going to kill you, and that's exactly what happened. And the story keeps going. For a practical perspective today, that's kind of where the narrative of the story ends. Let me ask you this. Are you confused yet? Are you confused? Like, how in the world did that qualify for an entry into the Faith Hall of Fame? How in the world is that a demonstration of faith that I can apply to my life? It actually is, in two ways. I have them there on your program. If you have one of those, you can fill in some blanks here. It's important. First of all is this. Jacob's blessings were in accordance with God's prophecy. Jacob's blessings were in accordance with God's prophecy. God prophesied that the older would serve the younger. Secondly, Jacob's blessings were in reliance upon God's provision. His blessings were in reliance upon God's provision. For both of his sons, he said that God would care for them. God would provide for them. And at first blush, that doesn't seem like a lot, that he was leaning into the prophecies of God and he was leaning into the provision of God. And yet, those two things were enough to earn him a place enshrined here in the Faith Hall of Fame. His blessings were in accordance with God's prophecy, and his blessings were in reliance upon God's provision. Those are the two ways in all of that narrative that we find Isaac demonstrating faith, modeling faith for us. You see, we have God's prophecies that we can lean into as well. As we try to pass on our faith and our life to our children, we need to do so in accordance with God's prophecies. And we need to do so according to God's provision. So yeah, that's actually very practical for us. It raises a couple of questions to kind of help us focus our thinking a little bit for us. First of all is this: do we know, believe, and live what God has said to us? Do we know, believe, and live what God has said to us? If we're going to teach our children, if we're going to try to encourage others, it needs to be in accordance with God's prophecy. We hold God's prophecies in our hands, in our laps, on our phones, on our tablets, in our hearts. Do we know that? Do we believe it? Do we live it out? There are a great many things in the Bible that are relevant to how we live our lives. Do we live accordingly? When God says do this, do you do it? When God said don't do that, do you not do that? I find the opposite is true. When God said do this, it's because I don't want to. And when he says don't do that, it's because I do want to. Do we live according to what God has revealed to us? Secondly, do we acknowledge that God is the provider of all that we have? Do we acknowledge that God is the provider of all we have? You know, it's easy to say, I get up on Monday morning and I go to work and I work full time and my wife works and you know, I invest and we save and we do this and we do that and it's by the sweat of our brow and the ability of our mind that we are able to procure the living and the lifestyle that we have. That's where most people live. Are we willing and able to acknowledge that all that we have comes from God? It's easy to say, I get up and I work full time to make the living that I make. How about God gives me the strength to be able to do that? How about God gave me the job to be able to do that in an economy that is continuing to shed jobs as companies try to get leaner and profit margins get tighter? The fact that we still are gainfully employed, that's a blessing from God. It's hard to remember on Monday morning, you're like, I hate my job, I don't want to go to work. That's the provision of God. It's important that we teach our children that, because kids inherently don't understand the value of money. Just this week, one of my kids held up a card and said, look, you have money, you have a credit card. Like, it doesn't work that way. Unless you want to get yourself in trouble, it doesn't work that way. He's like, oh, do you need to reload it? I'm like, I need to pay the bill. I guess that's about the same thing, right? I need to reload my credit cards. Too many of us live like our credit cards are a full house. You know, 2 MasterCards and 3 Visas. Full house. How about just acknowledging and teaching them that everything that we have has been provided by God? The job that I have, the income that I earn, is because God has graced me with a job and the strength and the health that I need to go to work to have this income. Do we acknowledge that God is the provider of all that we have? And lastly, do we relay these ideas to our children? Do we know, believe, and live what God has said to us? Do we acknowledge that God is the provider of all that we have? And do we relay those ideas to our children? Because if we don't relay those ideas to our children, they're not going to share our faith and they're not going to share our life. When they're old enough to decide for themselves, they're going to decide to walk away. We have to live it. We have to teach it. We have to relay it on purpose. It's not going to happen on accident. And so that's where Isaac leaves us with this Faith Hall of Fame. It's an interesting entry. And I keep thinking, wow, it's great that all of these people lived in a trailer park. You know, because I kind of feel that way, and I read through the patriarchs. I'm like, really? God, really? I don't feel so bad about me now because they were a disaster. And yet they did amazing things for God, and really, God did amazing things through them, is really what it boils down to. We can have Hall of Fame caliber faith. It is attainable to us. These people were just like us. We can be just like them. Are we willing to believe what God has told us? Are we willing to be in a relationship with God? That's the main thing that they had going for them more than anything else. God wants to be in relationship with us. He sent Jesus to die in our place for our sins so that we could be in relationship with Him by just saying yes. And then once we get that, we just walk with Him And He does amazing things through us that makes us far more than we would have been on our own. That's where we'll end our tour for the day. Father, we love you. I thank you for your word. Lord, I thank you for Isaac. What a colorful person from a colorful family. And yet, even here, we learn what it is to have a Hall of Fame caliber faith. Father, as parents, each of us want our children to have our faith and to hold our faith as dearly as we do. We want our children to have good lives, avoiding the baggage that some of us carry, and just knowing the fulfillment of life in you. Father, that's our desire this morning. Would you help us to learn from Isaac how that we make that possible? Would you help us to have the faith that blesses our children, not by being perfect, but by believing what you've told us, living it out, by understanding that you provide for us and living that out, and then making sure we intentionally relay that information to our children in a way that they wrap their heads and their hearts around, so that when it's their time to make their decision about how they're going to live their life, they will already understand that you have revealed much that they need to live out. They will already understand that you provide much that they need to receive, and that they would walk in those truths as well. Father, that's our desire this morning.